This episode, I'm joined by philosopher Barry Allen to discuss his recently released book, Living in Time, The Philosophy of Henri Bergson. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Barry Allen, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing your recently published book, Living in Time, The Philosophy of Henri Bergson, which was published by Oxford University Press 2023 this year, who I should say were kind enough to send me a copy of the book. So thanks very much to Oxford University Press. But before we jump in with Bergson and your book, Barry, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and how it is you came to write a book about Bergson.
Yes, I teach philosophy at a Canadian university, McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Back in graduate school, I wrote a dissertation on Wittgenstein under Richard Rorty, and then he was able to persuade my current institution that I was able to teach continental philosophy, even though I had written on Wittgenstein. So I dutifully came here and started immersing myself in continental philosophy. It wasn't entirely new to me, but I had never had responsibility for teaching it. So I was very busy reading everything from Nietzsche and Heidegger to Derrida and Foucault. And I put off Deleuze because Deleuze doesn't really fit into this line of what in Anglophone, what we think of as continental philosophy. Because he's really only people who never read him would think of assimilating him to Foucault, say, or to Derrida. Therefore, since I was working so hard to try to understand Nietzsche and Derrida and Foucault, I just found Deleuze really hard to understand and motivate. I didn't know what was behind it. So I just put it off. And was very happy that way for several years until eventually I said that this is time and this is going to have to stop. So I'm going to have to try to find out what this Deleuze business is all about. So I began immersing myself in that. And of course, I found it extremely good. In fact, I think I probably have a higher opinion of Deleuze than I do of, say, Derrida. He's an extremely acute philosopher. He's just hard to understand. But reading Deleuze, I then began to observe the thread of Bergson that runs not only just the obvious titles like his book on Bergson, but once you begin to know what Bergson trails look like, you see it everywhere in his work. And so at that point, I decided, well, I better find out about Bergson. And then the more I got into Bergson, the less I cared about Deleuze and just wanted to really try to understand what Bergson was doing, because it seemed to me to be certainly at least as interesting and innovative as anything that Deleuze was doing. And so that started me, and the book was the result.
Mm-hmm. I actually have a couple of questions just from that. I mean, before we really get into the waters of Bergson, I mean, one is what was the biggest, because it's such a strange thing to go from writing under Rorty to then go teach continental. I mean, it's quite a big leap. I mean, what was the biggest philosophical shock moving from analytic to continental?
Well, one little bit of the story that I didn't mention is that my original plan had been to write a dissertation on Heidegger. And this was much less shocking to me than it was to the Princeton faculty. They were absolutely freaked out by this because nobody had ever, in a million years, had ever proposed such a thing to them. But they dutifully let me try it. And I went off to Germany and spent a year at the Free University of Berlin. Germany was still divided. This was the mid-1980s. And then learning about Heidegger, I met a couple of his former students and talking about it, it began to dawn on me that it was really no way that I was ever going to write a dissertation that would be acceptable at Princeton on this topic. And I had followed Rorty's advice. He said, when you go to Germany, leave all your English books behind. Don't take a bunch of English language stuff with you. So the only book that I had brought with me was Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations in German. I figured I could always work on that. And so I started looking at that again. And of course, just before I'd left Princeton, one of the new biggest things that had exploded there was Kripke's Wittgenstein interpretation. At the time, it was just brand new, and everybody was really concerned about what are rules and what's rule following. And so I began thinking about that, and I actually wrote the first draft of my Wittgenstein dissertation in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. So when I came back and was looking for jobs, it wasn't sheer fantasy on his part that I could teach continental philosophy, because I'd worked substantially on Wittgenstein or on Heidegger, and that was a start, and it was. So, but it just means that I set aside all the Wittgenstein stuff and just immersed myself in a whole new set of questions.
Okay, I see. And I mean, you mentioned sort of delaying Deleuze, which a lot it's fairly common to delay Deleuze, but you did also mention that you did it so maybe later on you can understand him. I mean, I asked the big question: do you feel now that you do understand Deleuze?
Well, I understand him a lot better. And in particular, once I realized that this notion of continental philosophy is really just an Anglophone invention, and it assimilates lots of people that the French or the Germans would never think of putting in the same pocket. I needed to appreciate why Deleuze was not a Heideggerian, why he was not a Derridian, and consequently had to read more of the things that he himself had been reading and were important to him, Bergson certainly being one. So I've written my previous book, Empiricisms, has an entire chapter on Deleuze, realizing that Deleuze could call himself an empiricist. In Rorty's language, empiricism is just a name for a horrible mistake. And it took me a long time to get out of that trap and to try to begin asking myself the questions I was in that book. What really is empiricism? It's a lot more. I mean, if you listen to Rorty, it's just the story from Locke to Descartes, or from Locke and Descartes to Kant. But in truth, there's a vastly denser, more variegated fabric to empiricism. And I wanted to lay out all that background so I could say, in what sense, how is Deleuze an empiricist and how is he not? Or what does empiricism mean in this supercharged and very unfamiliar context? And I think that was certainly interesting. And I feel happy enough with my conclusions, such as they are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, that did lead you to our discussion today, which is Bergson. And I guess the place I wanted to begin with Bergson is, I mean, so your book, I'll say that your book is split into four. There's an introduction, a very short introduction, a conclusion, and then four chapters. And it's in a very sort of surprisingly, I guess, for people who've tried to tackle Bergson, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, it's like surprisingly accessible, like surprisingly erudite, in the sense that Bergson is quite a slippery philosopher. There's a lot of, quite literally, a lot of flux and intermingling, and I think with Bergson, any point when you're trying to really hone down a definition, there's a bit of trepidation, I mean, in relation to the philosophy itself, and whether or not you agree, perhaps we can get to. But so the biographical aspects don't factor in as much in your book, but I think there's just something to mention in the fact that Bergson historically was basically a celebrity and fell from grace. So at a certain point in time, he was this huge figure, and then eventually he sort of falls away. And I mean, I'm just wondering your opinions as to this trajectory, why you think that was.
I wish I could really do justice to your question, but I'm not an intellectual historian, in particular not one about the ins and outs of subtle French changes of view. But my impression is that his fame was really the product of his public lectures once he became a member of the Academy there. And the public lectures became very, very popular and fashionable, attracted huge audiences. But his reputation didn't survive the First World War. By the end of the First World War, I think my impression is that French intellectuals were really just looking for something new and didn't want to return to the things that had made Bergson prominent before the war. They didn't really criticize him so much as they just felt that he was a kind of a wearisome language game that they didn't want to play anymore. And he was also a little bit discredited because he had been somewhat of a propagandist for the French during the war. I mean, he certainly didn't. He was an ambassador to the White House, for example, for the French government. And so a new generation of French intellectuals were not really interested in reconnecting with something that seemed to them on the backside of the war experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And where I guess, reaching backwards in time, where does Bergson's philosophy begin? I mean, who are his key influences in building this? In my own opinion, kind of quite a peculiar philosophy Bergson holds. But where does he begin?
Yes, and he hides his sources very well. So you really won't figure them out just by trying to read him, and certainly not by going by his references, which he pretty much almost ignores. And once again, you really should be asking a historian of French intellectual history. But I do have an impression that one of the most important lines in which Bergson figures is one that has very little resonance for Anglophone readers. Anglophone readers, much of the work hasn't even been translated. It's only beginning to be appreciated. Now, that's the line that runs from Leibniz, the New Essays on Human Understanding, which is a book that Leibniz wrote in French, initiating a dialogue with English philosopher John Locke. And then the New Essays gave rise to a minor line in French 19th century thought, from Maine de Biran to Félix Ravissant. And Bergson comes at the end of that, inheriting primarily from Maine de Biran and Ravissant. This is a line that is almost completely unknown in Anglophone philosophy. It's only just within the last couple of years that Ravissant and Maine de Biran have begun to be translated even.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess it's a question tangential to that. We're now about to tackle the philosophy, but is there perhaps something within Bergson's philosophy that you see as the reasons why? I mean, once again, I guess this is a historical question, but as to why there has been this sort of lack of popularity. I mean, you say that it hasn't been translated, these influences. Do you see something in it where, classically we have the split between Heraclitus and Parmenides? Like, is there do you see a reason why we might head towards one philosophy, and there's a reason why those philosophers that haven't been translated and Bergson's philosophies just hasn't really stuck? I mean, I guess maybe a move through to existentialism was one as well, but
I guess so. And that the line that goes from Leibniz, Maine de Biran to Ravissant is not, if I can put it this way, it's not exactly sexy the way that existentialism was, or Heidegger. It's rather academic. It's kind of philosophy. I mean, it's still, philosophers arguing. It's somewhat of a minor direction, because Maine de Biran was emphasizing ideas about event and action and time that were difficult to reconcile with received ideas about substance. So it was an interesting innovation in metaphysics, but also a somewhat narrow one that I guess just not enough English readers were stimulated by it to sustain interest in it. And then, of course, also for Bergson's book himself, Bergson had, of course, lots of Anglophone readers. His books were translated almost immediately. The translations, as it happens, were all very good. Despite all this re-interest in Bergson, nobody's suggesting we need to do the translations over again. Bergson had excellent English. His mother was English, and they always spoke and corresponded in English. So Bergson checked all of the translations, really first rate. But he doesn't refer to any of these sources. As I say, he hides his own sources very well. So if you're just an English reader reading English translations of Bergson, you'd never in a million years guess about Leibniz or Maine de Biran, and Ravissant would be just an unknown name to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if this is a huge question to begin the talk of his philosophy. Is there a question for Bergson from these influences that you've sort of found beneath is there a question that emerges for him that his philosophy forms around, or would that be too restrictive for him?
Oh, there definitely is. It's the question of time. It's the absolute centerpiece of everything. And his great realization was understanding that practically everything in philosophy is going to change its valence once you have what he regards as a philosophically sophisticated understanding of time. So it's the absolute centerpiece, and all of his books are really just unfolding different dimensions of what he thinks he discovered when he started taking time seriously, instead of just assuming that it could be handled the way that his own influences had handled it traditionally. Especially Herbert Spencer is a big influence in his early days.
So when we think of time, what is it to not take time seriously? Is that the notion of we can take a little piece of time and we can have it, separate it, and say that's that bit of time?
Well, above all, it's what he calls spatialization. That is, it's assimilating time to space. There are different ways that you can do it, but it amounts to treating time as if it were a spatial dimension, as opposed to a continuum of change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I guess the difficult question from that is what are the two, I guess, metaphysical or almost mental differences that come from treating time in those two different ways? So one, what happens when we do treat time as spatialized, as just a product of space?
Then we get Western metaphysics from Parmenides to Hegel. We get the idea that becoming is an accident, that being is timeless, that the appearance of change is merely an appearance, that the very appearance of time's passage, that these are all sheer phenomenal artifacts with no reality at all, that true reality is a changeless, eternal what is.
Is there any sympathy on Bergson's part in terms of like what we might consider a Parmenidean strain, where he might say this is where we could have, a strict being that is stable, that is outside of becoming? Is there any point where he might hold to that?
No, not at all. Absolutely not. He tries to understand. It's not an arbitrary. So he tries to understand why it pressed itself upon us. But it is, from his point of view, completely mistaken, philosophically mistaken. There are certain things that can be said in favor of it, but they're not philosophical reasons for taking it, giving it credit.
It's pretty, I guess, a question which would have a lot behind it. But how does he come to this conclusion that being is philosophically incorrect and that becoming is all things? The first step of the argument is to affirm the priority of becoming. So the result of that is that it means that anything that we call a being and consider that it's done with its becoming, or it has become something and now that's finished, although it might change in the future, that these ideas, although they have a certain psychological and even a biological or evolutionary explanation, have no validity. That the only reality, extra-personal reality, is one of continuous becoming, and so being is always just an artifact of a point of view. And then the ego plays a role as perhaps the thing which seems like the illusion that holds, that does seek to divide consciousness up, to divide this becoming up, and yet that would equally be part of the process as well, even though we feel ourselves to have this solidified, I guess called like a being ego, this thing which is somehow whole throughout becoming, is still completely immanent to that whole process of becoming.
Yes, and ego is a word he practically never uses, but he speaks of the moi, the me, the self. And this for him is really just a word for the corporeal or living body center. The living body is a center from which stimuli are received and actions go out. So stimuli come in, actions go out. The body is really just this functional center linking stimuli coming in and actions going back out. So it's a body that's just a center of life activities, but it is itself completely a processual quality.
So there would
of course, the big thing that's in the background is his assumption that all life needs to solidify and act as if there were beings, as recognizable things. It's an adaptive action, and it's it's justified only in the sense that it's a good way to survive in a terrestrial environment. But as I say, it's a totally not a philosophical justification for an ontology of being.
No, it does seem like a bit of a leap. I mean, I would ask, where for Bergson does the agency for that solidification arise from?
From to what we could call the mind. A mind is a kind of a, well, to use his language, a spiritual power, a power that has certain agency. That agency drives it to do what it can to create a body for the purpose of replication. But that the only agency that he acknowledges is spiritual. And spiritual doesn't mean immaterial. I mean, it implies immateriality, but it's not ghostly. It just means temporal. Temporal things are immaterial too. Time is not a body, and time doesn't generate bodies, although it might generate the appearance of bodies.
Is it spiritual in relation to a godhead, into a monotheistic?
This is another place where Anglophone presumptions get in the way. God is really just not one of his words. He practically never uses the word or really says anything that's greatly philosophically or theologically much interesting. He's much more interested in the spirit that he sees active in human beings, and he thinks that this spiritual dimension of humanity has a future, that it will continue to evolve, or it may continue. Doesn't have to. And if it were able to continue to evolve and evolve and evolve as far as it could go, it might eventually become something that we would call a god, or many gods. Doesn't have to be just one. But monotheistic, orthodox deity is really just not a concept for him. He just has really nothing to say about it.
So before we move through, because you mentioned evolution, so we'll get to that, but I just want to stick with just where we've been for just one more question, because so far, and I think this is why, I mean, I remember when I first was reading Bergson, this is why I was felt like I was, I don't know, skating on ice without skates, right? It's all this, so far we've had becoming, everything is becoming, and being in that sense is not anything to do with Bergson. And in this way, there's this question of, if everything is becoming, and then let's say something does change in time, which is a noticeable, I guess, dare I say, empirical change, like a building falling over. In our memory, we have this change, but as we change, that memory is equally becoming with our other continual becoming. So all of this put together, what is it for Bergson to say, to define, to say that is that? Is that an error on our part? In our attempts to control, to try retrieve something from becoming and capture it? How can we begin to define if all is always moving?
It's not an error in the sense that that if you're a living organism, you've got no choice. But also that shows you the limit of it. That's all there is to it. It's just simply an adaptive strategy. With no metaphysical truth whatsoever. And moreover, it's an adaptive strategy that will produce a different ontology for every organism that there is, because octopuses aren't going to cut out the world the same way that whales do or that mammals do. But there's no objectively right or wrong different ways of doing it. So being is really just a strongly perspectival solidification, good for the life form that utilizes it, but with no broader reality.
Well, what would it be for a human to not solidify, to not cut up reality? Would that be a possibility?
Psychotic. It's not a psychotic. It's not a. Nobody can live that. It'd be like, it just. The more you think about it, the more bizarre it would be. Where would you lay down to go to bed at night?
There'll be no such thing as bad, right?
No such thing as bad. What would you eat? How would you move? Why would you wear shoes? It would just be total psychosis.
Mm. So does freedom then come from, I don't know why I said that, but does freedom for Bergson then come from perhaps as little fragmentation, as little limitation as possible, or is this sort of almost like, look, you just have to accept that and then work with it? But or is there, you mentioned evolution, from this acceptance of you have to grasp, you have to cut, how do you begin to move forward, and where are we moving to?
Well, I guess there Bergson would be a bit of a dualist or a dichotomist. That is, if your question concerns how to get through the day, then you're gonna make lots of posits, and there's going to be lots of beings, and you're going to be engaged with them. But if you're setting all that aside and engaging in philosophy, then the only truth is really the truth of temporality and of yourself as a spiritual, that is a temporal being. There's not really any way to synthesize these philosophically. It's that we understand being as something that it's kind of a necessary error, necessary in the service of life. But we understand that it would be a mistake to try to regard it as anything deeper than that, and to try to build a philosophy, that is a philosophical view of reality, on that basis.
What of the past then? Is the past real in the once again, I guess this is a Western presumption in terms of linear time. These memories are simply memories, and those things weren't in terms of becoming, or?
Well, let's look at it this way. The best way to understand real is effective. Mm-hmm. Something is real if it has effects. And in that way, memory is the past. Memories aren't pictures of the past. They aren't representations of the past. Memories are how the past remains effective. And the equation that I just said, of real with effective, means memories are the way the past is real. The past is real as remembered.
And the future?
Wide open. It's not unlimited, because Bergson doesn't believe in an infinite universe, so there are certain constraints upon it, but there's certainly no determination, because the whole idea of determination is one being pushing another being, and that's all he's completely instrumentalized that. That's just a useful way to think about things, but it has no deeper truth. So there's no deep truth about determinism, and no inevitability for the future. The future instead is really constantly being negotiated between all the different forces that in each instance are competing for actual existence.
And then the present isn't? Is the now simply not?
It's just where the effectiveness of the past has led to the moment that you're beginning to think about it. And then, of course, as time goes on, it will the past will remain effective in different ways, and therefore the present will always be changing, because the past there's always more past, and its reality will be slightly different every time, because the totality of time it's how it is remembered and affected.
The way you've spoken about it so far, it seems that for Bergson, humans don't play, they're amidst everything else. They are just amidst becoming the same as everything else. So speaking of teleology and this notion of the spiritual, is there a teleology, and does it concern us too much in terms of, I guess the us is already a problem because of that defining aspect?
Well, we have certain powers that are not visible in the rest of nature, in particular language and technology. And these suggest to Bergson that we have certain possibilities of evolution that other animals don't share. it gives us a possibility of moving into a future that's quite different from the animals, which he thinks of as just constantly repeating themselves, endlessly going through relatively unchanging cycles. Whereas humanity has, because of speech and technology, the possibility of continuing the evolutionary movement. In fact, he thinks that that evolution really won't continue. He thinks all the power of evolution is now concentrated in humanity. In other words, if humanity doesn't evolve, evolution will basically just stop and it'll just start going in circles like it does with the other animals. So the human being is important in the sense that it has a possibility of evolution that is apparently closed to all other terrestrial life forms. And this excites Bergson a lot because he thinks that it's a drama. It makes the future dramatic. And it's dramatic precisely because although there's a possible future of human evolution, it's by no means guaranteed or mechanically or in any other way assured. It's a real struggle. But as I say, that makes it dramatic for him.
Could we opt out?
Yes, I suppose if we became, sort of like, I don't know if you know a little story that Nietzsche uses at the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he talks about the people that, wonder who is this Zarathustra and what's he so excited about? And why doesn't he calm down and take a pill? And, why is he calling us to do these things? Nietzsche calls these the last men, letzte men, letzte Menschen. Meaning that they're just not going to go anywhere. They're just going to be turning in circles until they eventually expire and life goes out like a candle. Bergson would say that's definitely possible. It can't really appeal to anybody, I shouldn't think. If it did, they would be so nihilistic that the disease is already done. But I suppose you could, if you wanted to try being completely nihilistic, one could. I don't know why one would, but
consciously give oneself over to, I guess, what Deleuze would call the eternal return of the same, right? Just go round and round in circles.
Yeah,
that's very bleak. I mean,
yes.
And where does, and this is like this mysterious concept which I always felt that academics were quite reluctant to touch upon, and in Bergson's philosophy, it doesn't get as big of a look in as perhaps it should. But the élan vital, where does this fit into this philosophy?
Yeah. I think that one of the reasons that Anglo readers have had just an impossible time trying to understand this word is a lot of wrong anticipations. The simplest way to elucidate élan vital is to say first that life on Earth is an event, a tendency. It's an event that happened about 4.5 billion years ago. It started. And it continues today. It continues according to a certain tendency. So you first of all you think life on Earth is one very large event tendency. Élan vital is a name for that tendency. It's a name for the tendency of life on Earth. That is, the assumption is that all life itself has a certain tendency. Is a directionality and impetus. Just saying that's élan vital. It's just simply a name for the tendency of a comprehensive terrestrial event that we call the evolution of life.
Some people often conflate it with sort of a spiritual force. I mean, that would be somewhat incorrect, or?
Well, it's just Anglophones reaching for grasping at straws. If you read Bergson very carefully, you'll see he doesn't speak that way. But if you're trying to explain him to your undergraduates or to your neighbors, you might reach for that because it's hard to contradict, and people might even pretend they understand it. But force is, strictly speaking, a word from mechanics. And it's a word for an actual configuration. Élan vital is not an actual configuration. It's a tendency. Tendencies are virtual entities. They're not actual entities. They're not mechanical causes, but they're not mysteries because practically all events do have tendencies. They're going in a certain direction. They have a certain teleological tendency, and élan vital is the name for that tendency when we're speaking about vital events, that is, living organisms.
I don't phrase it this way to be coy, but I think it's perhaps an interesting way. What is the tendency? Is it growth, building structure, the increase of energy? Because it seems, okay, we have that original tendency, which is like metaphorically behind things, behind this evolution that we've spoken about. Does that itself have, building structure as a common?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, the question is perfectly appropriate. The tendency of vital tendency is to incorporate as much of the matter in the universe as possible into life forms. In other words, the overall tendency is to try to vitalize matter. In principle, all matter, that is, all the matter in the universe. That is the tendency. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it's the movement. It's the tendency of the movement of life.
Mm-hmm. And how would this differ evolutionarily speaking? Because it's something really interesting that you point out in your book, as Bergson as a third evolutionary thinker from instead of, or perhaps not instead of, but alongside Darwin and Lamarck. How does that vitalist tendency differ in evolutionary terms from those two?
It's just even more teleological. Lamarck didn't really want to be a teleologist. In his view of nature is basically mechanical, but he just thought that there were certain mechanical causes that went beyond those that Darwin would later identify. But Bergson is a real, honest-to-God teleologist. That is, he thinks that evolution really is a teleological tendency working its way through the material universe. And that's way too metaphysical for Lamarck. Lamarck was a professional scientist, and the last thing he wanted was to be people saying, "Oh, you're blurring the lines now and talking like a metaphysician." And so he didn't really develop this line. I don't think he wanted to develop it. He just thought that you need a kind of causation. Of course, he's writing before Darwin. But we're always reading him in the light of Darwin. He thought you needed more than what Darwin would give us in terms of causation for evolution.
And then so for Bergson, at the end point of this teleology is all the energy in the universe would be somehow within this same vitalist impulse, like collected together, or how is that understood?
Well, that bit has to remain somewhat obscure, but it would be the idea would be to try to make life as comprehensive as it possibly can be. In other words, to eliminate any trace of matter that wasn't wrapped up in organisms and their life. Whether that would ultimately be lots and lots of organisms, but maybe just very different from what we now are, whether it would just be one great big one. These are things that I think Bergson doesn't really think it's profitable to try to guess about. The point that interests him is the directionality and not where it may or may not be ending. So the thing that there's a certain movement afoot, and it's been afoot ever since life on Earth. And the dramatic question is just how far and how long will it go?
Could I wake up tomorrow and head out the door and say, right, I'm going to help out the Bergsonian impulse and somehow consciously give myself over to this force, or is it far more abstract than that? Is this, in terms of this teleology, it's interesting that human beings holding this sort of unique position as that thing which now has the option to not just go round in circles. Could one consciously give themselves over to this?
Yes, and he develops this in his book on open and closed. Title is the two sources of religion and morality. What you would do is you would find yourself an organization, a political organization, for example, that is dedicated to what he calls the open society. That is a society that's not closed upon itself, that's not racist or basically racist, and that sees the great challenge of human existence as being to open up society as much as possible, to bring in as many different forms of life as possible under a type of government, liberalism, as happens in his opinion, that it will encourage this kind of forward movement and kind of spiritualization of life. So if you wanted to do what you describe, you couldn't do much on your own, but the thing to do would be to go out and find yourself a group of other people who are committed to a spiritual and dramatic conception of the future, who are committed to the opposition to racism and to everything that keeps society closed upon itself, and are committed to trying to break down all the barriers that keep human beings separated and isolated, and to try to allow them to work together, which would be the first step to eventually transcending ourselves.
So traditionalists are running in circles then?
Yeah. That's really what tradition is from a kind of an anthropological or ethnological point of view. That's since each generation is born, as a kind of a blank slate. So if somebody isn't repeating, then that each generation would have to invent it all by itself, and that would be, that's not really feasible. So tradition is our name for what you need to repeat in order to be able to establish yourself as a moderately competent human being among others, and to be able to do what you have to do to survive. But that's all it is. It's just a survival mechanism, really.
I sense some haste here. Is there a time limit? Could we throw this opportunity away and just stay running in the same spot?
Well, that would be Nietzsche's Last Man, and could, in the sense of, as far as logic is concerned, yes. There's no logic isn't in the opposition, and if the politics were particularly gruesome, and we got a couple of generations of gruesome politics where nobody cared anymore, and people were just trying to make sure that none of the outsiders got in where we were having a good time. We could forget all of our best parts and turn into those last men who really don't want to do anything more than simply take life easy and make it as pleasant as possible until we're finished. It's a theoretical possibility. There's nothing more than just luck and will and the determination of some people not to debase themselves in that way. The mere fact that you can consider it debasing, or that, as you and I were saying earlier, that it seems nihilistic, that already shows that we're not prepared to really take this as a promising avenue. But other people might respond differently.
And though I didn't want to comment too much on him in terms of your own studies on Deleuze, what do you see as the key difference between Bergson and Deleuze's Bergson?
Yeah, that's a pretty difficult question.
Quite a tough one. Sorry,
because Deleuze doesn't really. I guess it would be something like, read Bergson and then you'll take time seriously. And then once you take time seriously, then stop reading Bergson and read Deleuze, and I'll tell you what implications you should draw from that seriousness about time that won't be fully Bergson's implications. For example, Bergson is much more, politically speaking, he really is just a kind of a late 19th century liberal. He believes in a kind of liberal society, whereas Deleuze considers all of that completely bourgeois and utterly passé, and identifies, at least he says it, that he's a communist, which is something that Bergson would certainly never say. So it may be that at the level of metaphysics, there's not a huge difference between Deleuze and his conclusions and Bergson's, but the way they work out in terms of contemporary practice would be substantially different.
Deleuze is. You talk about the open and closed. Deleuze, maybe it's closed, open, and then schizophrenic in the Deleuzean sense, right? The real explosion of openness, almost too much, perhaps too much openness when you get through to something like Anti-Oedipus.
Well, yes, although I would think that so long as it's not destructive, it's just unfolding even more possibilities, or getting rid of a raft of hesitations that we have inherited, and instead of I mean, so the mere fact that someone is psychotic no longer becomes a reason not to listen to them anymore. Bergson never dreamed. I mean, it's hard to imagine Bergson ever dreaming of saying such a thing. But it's not an impossible reading of what an open society would be.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question here. I can actually see from your video. I can see your is that karate belts, or I can't recognize the belts exactly.
Well, it's actually the Chinese on there says Hapkido, or the Chinese translation of the Korean Hapkido. Is that black belt?
Black belt.
It's a third degree black belt in the Korean art called Hapkido.
Is that? I'm going to assume that's your primary martial art.
Well, it was until COVID. And COVID put a great big dent in that, because if there's one, when you practice martial arts, when you train martial arts, you are in another person's face big. Mm-hmm. And so if you're sensitive about maybe getting a little spittle on your lips, then it's just not the right thing for you. Mm-hmm. When COVID came, everything just had to close. The place where I had been training, the master tried after about 18 months, said, maybe we can get this going. So we'll have some kind of training, but we'll stand 6 feet apart, and I'll just move my arms this way and say, now you move your arms that way too, but we won't touch. And I just said, I just don't want to train that way. I mean, I understand that there's no alternative, even legally, but I don't want to train that way. And so I said that then, therefore, after 17 years, I retire.
So in relation to Bergson, would you say the vitalism had been, because the question was, I mean, is there an overlap between, because I know you've written a book on the philosophy of Asian martial arts. Is there an overlap between, I guess, your personal study of martial arts, or personal practice of martial arts and study, and the philosophy of Bergson?
Well, not a big one, but just that Bergson certainly provides a set of concepts and motivations for thinking about the body in action, which are very different from anything that Anglo tradition has. So if you're trying to think philosophically about martial arts, then one thing practically the main thing you're going to be thinking about is, how does a body move? How can move? What's involved in learning movement, teaching movement? How do movements become effective? And what is learning movement? These kind of questions Bergson is very interested in, and his work provides ways of thinking about it that certainly can be valuable for martial arts study, for the philosophy of martial arts. But there are other things too. I mean, phenomenology of action is equally good in this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, perhaps if you're interested, I'd love to talk to you another time about your book on martial arts, if you'd be up for that. But one final question here. I mean, a couple of final questions, but one is, I mean, you mentioned, you sort of drew this in at the start, and it's been recurrent throughout our conversation. I've noticed this struggle with, when you mention something from Bergson, you have to sort of say, well, the Western mind would jump to this conclusion, and what do you?
The
Anglophone mind would jump to a certain conclusion, and what do you think the kernel, if there is one, of the Anglophone thought that just sort of keeps trying to put a wall down, or just doesn't really allow itself to fall into Bergson's philosophy properly?
It may be partly suspicion about time. That really is Western, not Anglophone. Mm-hmm. Ever since the beginning of philosophy in the West, time has been shunted aside, or there have been efforts to try to explain it away, or make it disappear, or treat it as space. And English Anglophone philosophy inherits that without really even much thought about it. And the other is a certain Anglophone suspicion about immateriality, that if you're immaterial, it must be because you think that there's a substance that's immaterial, a ghostly substance, an immaterial substance. Bergson is interested in immaterial reality, but not immaterial substance. And immaterial, it suddenly doesn't sound so spooky anymore when you realize it's just time. I mean, a passage of time, a duration of time, there's no matter there, or if there is, it's not the same as the time. So time is inherently immaterial. That is, it's not any material substance or existence. Anglophone philosophy has had practically no motivation to try to think these things. And when they appear in Bergson, they just seem alien and hard to understand. And so Anglophone philosophers tend to simply reach for jokes and dismiss it. So there's been very little effort on the part of Anglophone philosophers to really try to say, look, what really is this? I mean, there have been some scholarship about Bergson. I don't mean to say there hasn't, but it's never been mainstream. And it certainly never got into the principal arguments that have been the meat and butter of academic, especially analytic philosophy in the Anglophone tradition.
Okay. Well, where would you advise people to begin with Bergson's primary work? I mean, secondary sources, I'll say it, I would advise people to begin with your book, Living in Time, because I think it's a fantastic introduction to Bergson's work. But as for his primary source work, his own work, where would you advise people to begin?
Well, one thing to remember is that the translations are trustworthy and really very good. Another thing to remember is that Bergson is not going to make a lot of assumptions that you will have been trained to make if you're reading Anglophone philosophy. So you have to sort of know that you're reading someone who's not thinking the way that you're accustomed to if you've been studying English-speaking philosophy. In terms of where to start, I mean, all of the books have the books are all of them are in some way disarmingly clear. Because you read along, you think, well, I'm understanding this, and there's no words that are really that alien to me. But if you stop after, say, 50 or 60 pages and say, what have I just been reading? It can be pretty hard to paraphrase. And each of the books is difficult in its own way from that point of view. For example, Time and Free Will. That, incidentally, was a title that Bergson himself, an English title Bergson himself made up. The French version has got a completely different title. I don't even know what it is in French. It's an essay on something. But the book begins with a very long discussion about 19th century psychology, about inner mental states. And you have to kind of be willing to play along with that, or pretend that you're interested in it, or at least you're struggling with it, because he's citing tons of literature. He's not making this up, but it's just psychology of a much earlier day. But the conclusions that he'll gradually move to are philosophically quite rich and provocative, but you just have to have patience. You can say the same thing about memory and matter and memory, although it's a different set of problems. But again, you have to be patient and let him talk a lot about 19th century physiology, understandings of the moving body in French psychology. But if you'll bear with him, eventually he'll get to some pretty meaty conclusions. A lot of people probably start with Creative Evolution just because it's his most famous book. And, possibly, since, he's never going to write really pedagogically. So he's never going to say, okay, let's begin with this one really clear thing and sort of gradually put it together. That's for books like mine to try to do, but not his. So I think the truth is that it doesn't greatly matter where you start. And some people, for example, my teacher, Richard Rorty, he read all of Bergson's books, thought they were absolutely intolerable and completely just beyond the pale, except for the two essays on religion and morality, which he actually quite liked. Now, I don't really understand how somebody could like that book and not like, or at least not understand, all the other stuff, because I think they're pretty intimately connected. But he evidently felt that you could make a fairly sharp line between them, and he could enjoy the one and hate the rest. So I would say that it truly doesn't matter where you start, so long as you're willing to be patient and eventually at least try to read the first three. That is Time and Free Will, Matter and Memory, and Creative Evolution.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about your own book that you feel we haven't touched upon that is key?
No, not really. I'm very generous, and so I hope there's something in it for everybody.
Mm-hmm. What are you working on now?
Right now, I'm two projects going. One is just a little project, but I agreed to write something. There's a book coming out on Richard Rorty's book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, will soon be reaching its 50th anniversary. And Cambridge University Press is having a series of Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature at 50. And there's a lot of other books, like there's Rawls at 50, etc. And the editor asked me to write something about Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature and Wittgenstein. So I've been going back. This is stuff I haven't looked at in 20 years or more, but I've been going back and trying to remind myself about what was involved in that. It's been somewhat interesting. It's been a long time since I really thought newly and freshly about Richard Rorty's work. But that's just a kind of a side project. The really big thing that I'm working on now is an effort to try to synthesize or bring together a conversation between professional philosophy and Native American traditions and Native American thought, Indians. There's many different sides to it, but it's an attempt to try to bring together the traditions and culture of North American indigenous peoples with Western philosophy, themes from Western philosophy.
Sounds fascinating. When that's going to be a full book?
That's the plan. It's in various forms of draft. I've sent a little bit of it out in driblets to some of the journals and had various kinds of responses, but eventually it will certainly be a book. That's my plan.
Okay. Well, hopefully when that's published, I'll get back in contact with you and talk about that.
Well, I hope you're still in business.
Oh, I hope so too. But I'll be sure to put the links for Living in Time in the description below. And but other than that, Barry Allen, it's been a fantastic conversation. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much for your time.